the way I was raised with, you can ask questions, you can challenge the system, to come to a place and then to come into education and to be told directly and indirectly, this is the way we do things, this is the way it's always been, don't ask questions, just go with the flow, pick your battles, a bunch of other cliches that they have here, which all basically translate to, I'm too afraid to speak up when I see something that's wrong.
Welcome to What's the Big Idea? I'm your host, Dan Carney. I have got some incredible episodes coming up, including Julia Fliss talking about globally minded education, Ebony Rice from the News Literacy Project, talking about media literacy, news literacy, and helping students navigate the media-saturated environment that they live in. And Pernille Ripp is going to be on discussing cultivating authentic readers in our classrooms. 3 amazing episodes. But I wanted to jump the line, so to speak, with an interview I did recently with Monise Seward. Monise is a really knowledgeable, thoughtful, and candid person. And she's a special education teacher and interventionist living in Georgia. And lived in Georgia the last school year. And we had a really great conversation. She was very emotional, actually, about the last year and very thoughtful and reflective and honest about some important issues in this country, like COVID, like race, like the election that we had. And I wanted to bring her on as we're all going back to school. Most of us are already back at school by now, as kind of in a way, a bookend to the 2020-2021 school year and a segue into the new school year. And just she's just an impressive, honest voice. And if you just want to hear an educator talk about the difficulties, the real challenges from last year and hopes for this year, and just commentary on our country in general, stick around for this interview with Monise Seward. Okay, it gives me great pleasure to welcome now on the podcast special education teacher, interventionist, prolific tweeter of wisdom, and friend of the pod, Monise Seward. Monise, how are you? Thanks for coming back.
I need you to send that to me so I can change my bio and use that.
So we spoke a year ago. It was almost exactly a year ago. And, a lot of the conversation was on how schools had basically bungled the summer trying to decide whether to be online or be in person. And then pretty much they were going to be online, but hadn't taken the time to get ready. So I guess my first question is, what was last year like for you? You're in Georgia, and we got a lot to unpack with you being in Georgia. But just in general, how did the school year go for you last year?
Okay, so we started off virtually, right? We were virtual until the end of February, beginning of March, okay? However, teachers in my district, we went back into the building in February to get ready for the kids to come back. So when some of the kids came back, because not everyone came back, we were teaching virtually and the kids who came back. So we were teaching in person and virtually. In a nutshell, it was a nightmare. I'm one of those teachers who, and I'm not trying to get a pat on the back or anything, but I'm one of those teachers who went in early, stayed late, because I wanted to make sure that I was ready for the next day, right? So once we went back in the building, I said, I'm not going in early, I'm not staying late. Because in my mind, I didn't see any logical reason for us to go back into the building, because the time we went back into the building, the governor had refused to put teachers on the list to be vaccinated, right? So a few weeks before the students came back, another teacher works in the same district that I follow on Twitter, sent me a DM. He said, you know, you can go to Alabama to get vaccinated. I was like, are you sure? They were like, yeah. I said, are you positive? I said, because I don't want to drive there and then get told that I can't because I don't live in Georgia. And they told me, sign up, because I know a lot of people who've already done it. I was like, wow. I felt kind of bad, you know, because people were talking about vaccine tourism. But at the same time, when I went to get my first dose, I talked to the people who worked there. I said, have you had a lot of people come in? They said, yeah, mostly teachers from Georgia and Florida. And they said a lot of the local people hadn't signed up. And so I got my first dose and the kids came back. And then a few weeks later, I got my second dose. I went to the same place. But it's like, how are you a governor pushing for schools to go back to face, but you don't prioritize school staff and put us on the list to get vaccinated? And so I think he made the announcement that teachers can now get vaccinated, but I had already made my appointment. So it did me no good, because I was not going back into a building to work with people who, first of all, didn't think COVID was serious back in, what was it, March 2020. They didn't think it was serious. And then people who didn't believe or trust in the vaccine, right? I was not going back into the building with those people if I didn't have the opportunity to get vaccinated. So I took it.
Yeah. Did you have a feeling, I wonder with teachers everywhere across the country, could you get a feeling in that moment among teachers, among the staff, who was going to get vaccinated, who'd gotten vaccinated? Could you get a feel for who was going to be resistant? Yeah.
Absolutely. Just, and because, okay, so April-ish, early March 2020 is when we really started hearing stuff, right? People were like, oh, it's no worse. They were literally saying in my building, oh, it's no worse than the flu. I was like, I don't know. And then we started having conversations, like small groups of us, like, well, so-and-so was out for like 3 weeks in between November and December. I wonder if they had it. Literally, we started thinking back, oh, that's why all those people were sick in November and December for such a long, not a couple of days, but they were out for weeks. And some people were in the hospital saying it was just a bad flu or it was pneumonia. Those people likely had COVID. And so they were in our building, but we didn't know it at the time what it was until April and March came around. And we started hearing about, there were some teachers in Metro Atlanta who died, right? There were some teachers in Metro Atlanta who were testing positive and they had to go in and sanitize schools. And so then finally, when we were told that we were going to go home and we didn't know how long, you know, in March, people were like, oh, this is serious. But even with people dying, you don't even have to know the people who were dying, but people in our profession were dying, right? And then all these cases started springing up. Why was that not enough for you to say, you know what, I was wrong? I really need to reconsider and look at and pay attention to the numbers.
And I'm out here in blue California, and you know, it certainly has not gone perfectly. But one thing throughout this whole process is that I think teachers generally have felt like state government has had their backs. I think the governor, state government has generally tried to do right by teachers, maybe not always perfectly. But you're in a part of the country where you probably can't say that. I get the feeling that probably Kemp and state government did not have teachers' interests in mind.
Not at all. I think he even got vaccinated before teachers did, but he also tested positive for COVID, I think twice. He and his wife, I believe. But his reaction didn't surprise me because of what happened around the election. And with basically trying to strong arm the Secretary of State into giving the outcome that they wanted. His reaction didn't surprise me. So that's why when I was told I could go to Alabama to get a vaccine, I said, okay, I'm going to go ahead and do it.
sort of ideology over public health.
Mm-hmm.
And
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Because remember, in the beginning of COVID, the majority of the people who were dying were African American and Hispanic, remember? And so they wouldn't necessarily say it out loud, but they were walking around with the assumption that they couldn't get it, or that if they got it, they wouldn't die, because the medical professionals were telling us that people with underlying health conditions and Blacks and Hispanics were suffering the most. So people were assuming that, oh, I'm not Black, I'm not Hispanic, I don't have any underlying health conditions. So if I get it, I'm just going to be sick, I'm not going to die. But then quickly, we saw how that changed, right? So.
Yeah, the inequities conversation is a big one too, but definitely here as we got into the winter and there's a huge surge, people started to wake up a little bit. And as you said, couldn't sort of point to, well, I don't fall into those categories. Before we get to some of that and in the election, certainly, you brought up what I think is going to be one of the enduring memories of all of this, and that is teaching a room full of students while students are also online. This was something else. What was that like for you, and how did your students handle it, getting through that?
This was my most challenging year. I taught students with disabilities. And generally what I do in the beginning of the school year is I walk students through what I need them to be able to do on the computer. I didn't have that luxury this past year because we didn't start face-to-face.
It was a big technological jump for a
Absolutely.
lot of teachers, right? So how about that? How prepared did you feel and your colleagues feel going into that?
I don't consider myself a tech guru or by any means, but I'm comfortable with technology to the point where if I need to figure out something, I'll try it myself first. Then there's Google, there's YouTube, and then there's my group of people that I interact with on Twitter. So I was not worried about whether I'd be able to use the technology. I was more concerned with how is this technology going to work for my students, and is this the right technology for my students? So those were my concerns. I tried to keep it simple like I did in the spring when we left, but Google made some improvements. So the Google Classroom was a little bit better. But it was still a lot to deal with. In the beginning, I would send reminds before every class started to my parents in English and in Spanish. Hey, first period is starting, they need to be logged on. And then did that for a number of months. And I was exhausted. But I had to make an effort to help them get online, right? Because I'd never met these students. I never met the parents. They didn't know me. But I wanted them to feel like, okay, this teacher is making an effort to reach out to us to try to help, our kids get online. But, some parents were still working. So if their kids were supposed to be up and online after the parents went to work, you know how kids are. They would say they were online, but they didn't get online. Then I would have to have those little personal conversations with the parents. And they would be like, well, they told me. I'm like, no. I did some home visits right in when the pandemic was like at its highest. I was like, Lord, I'm wearing my mask. I'm going to keep my distance, just keep me protected so I can go and these people can see my face and I can try to figure out why their kid is not logging on. I did that a few times too. But there were some kids who just either wouldn't log on, they logged on sporadically. And you know what? I had to stop taking it personally. Even though it hurt, because I knew, how do I say this? I knew that what's the word I'm looking for? The system or protocols we had in place. I knew that they would be detrimental to some students who didn't log on or who didn't do any work. I knew that. That's why I tried to get some of these kids to log in. But then, midway through second semester towards the end, if you're still not seeing kids and they're still not turning work in, what else could you do if, I'm going to add this, if the people in charge didn't have a contingency plan in place? They just told us to keep trying. And I'm thinking to myself, y'all had an entire summer, and the best you could tell us is to keep trying. Even after you get home visits, y'all want us to keep trying. Like at some point, that workload should have been taken off our plates, and it should have been handled by somebody else, because number one, I'm communicating with parents in Spanish. Number two, I have to log every single communication in our system. And then, you know, there's other things, like it triggers other things. And then you have to go from the beginning and explain, you know, why this kid doesn't have a grade. You can't post grades if there's nothing in there. So if I tell you from the beginning, this kid's not logging in, I've spoken to the parents, I've spoken to the kid, I've texted the parents, I went to his house and he looked me in my face and I showed him how to get logged in. I showed him how to check email, how to use Google Docs, and they're still not logging in. There's nothing else the teacher can do. So I think this year was a nightmare. I never, ever want to go through anything like that ever again.
I can hear in your voice as well. It took an emotional toll on you. How did the students do? I know you talked a bit about some of the struggles getting them online. How about social, emotional, your connection with them? Anything good come out of it, or was it really just a slog all year?
I had a couple students who did really well online. And then I had a couple students who, when they came into the building, did much better than they did online. And again, you have to factor in the amount of time they spent with technology in the prior school year, because most of them only used it to take tests. And then one of my students who I had to go visit, because I had to visit a few, but one of my students that I had to go visit actually did pretty good when they came back in the building. And I know it wasn't the most ideal situation, and I don't want anybody to think that I'm pushing for us to go back full speed ahead, but I did see some of the students who were kind of having a hard time online learning. They did do better when they came in, because they got to talk to me. I got to talk to them. And we got to work through some of the challenges they had with being online.
And I think a lot of teachers right now listening are nodding their heads. And we were talking before when we started the interview about how early so many school districts are going back this summer, early August, if not even earlier. And after last school year, it seems like a particularly insult to injury, I think, maybe. And throughout all this, you're going through this really difficult experience the last school year, and we can overlay that with the 2020 presidential election. You were in Georgia, which became sort of like the epicenter, the focal point of the election. What was that like when all that was happening with the disputed counts and and everything that was happening there?
Oh, Dan. I've been here 19 years. When 4 years ago, when Hillary won my county, Gwinnett, I knew we were closer. I was like, yeah, she didn't get it. Democrats didn't get it. I said, but we're closer. Then Stacey Abrams got robbed. And I was like, okay. But then when I saw Stacey Abrams and all the other people, I can't remember names right now, so I don't want to exclude them, because there were a lot of people doing the work. When they started getting these people registered to vote, and they were reminding people to go out and vote, even in the midterms, and I was like, you know what? We have a good shot at this. However, I had no clue that it would turn out the way it did in Georgia. Like, in terms of the governor trying to strong arm the Secretary of State, the president trying to strong arm the Secretary of State. There were a lot of instances of just outward open racism here that people who weren't here didn't see. Even within the local school board election for Gwinnett County, because we have a majority minority school board for the first time ever. And I knew that was coming because I've been here 19 years. I've been in Gwinnett 14 years. So I've kind of seen the shift in demographics. And I kind of expected some of the vitriol and racism. I kind of expected to hear some things from certain people because I've been here a long time. But boy, oh boy, am I glad that we mobilized enough people to turn Georgia blue. And I just hope that people remember you still have to vote in the midterms, because those are really, really important, especially for schools and the things we want to see done in our school districts. But then in the 4 years, you have to come back out and you have to vote again. So we can't rest. I won't be here. Hopefully I can go back to Indiana and get involved with politics there and get our state back to blue too, because it's now a red state. But people have to remember that you can't rest. Just because we won, you can't rest.
Did it surprise you at all how many people just became determined that something untoward had gone on?
Nope. How do I say this? This is a different place. You can ask anybody who's here who wasn't born and raised here. It's just a different place. They talk about Southern hospitality, but behind that hospitality, God knows what lies behind that hospitality, that fake smile. And one of my motivations for actually leaving is because I feel like I haven't scratched the surface with what I feel like I can do for kids in the classroom, because there's so much other stuff thrown in the mix. They're okay with you working yourself like a dog, but don't ask questions. They're okay with you spending your own money to get the stuff that's like a necessity, not the extra stuff that teachers would love to have, the necessities, but don't ask questions. It's just different, and it's hard to put it into words, but the way I was raised with, you can ask questions, you can challenge the system, to come to a place and then to come into education and to be told directly and indirectly, this is the way we do things, this is the way it's always been, don't ask questions, just go with the flow, pick your battles, a bunch of other cliches that they have here, which all basically translate to, I'm too afraid to speak up when I see something that's wrong. So you want me to be an advocate for children, and especially children with disabilities, but you don't want me to interrogate the system when the system is doing something that is inherently wrong and is not in the best interest of those students. So to me, it's like a contradiction. You want me to do this part, but you don't want me to do that part. And if I'm a teacher, all those things go into what I do. So I can't do one and not do the other.
Yeah, and I think you described that so accurately. The system has so many interlocking parts: parents, administrators, state government, local government, and then the teachers. And unless everyone is willing to take a big step forward, move in a new direction, teachers are largely left to their own devices and unable to do what they want to do unless they feel they have that support. Thinking back to some of that stuff that was happening in Georgia during the election, I think back like a decade ago. You remember those ridiculous forums they would have where these people would get up and claim they had Obama's birth certificate, right? They'd get up there and they'd be like frothing at the mouth that they saw this birth certificate. I feel like we see these, it's like a daily basis, one of these pops up on the internet. It was people in Georgia screaming about stolen elections. Then it was masks. Now it's people screaming about critical race theory, or in California here we have a thing called ethnic studies. It's like this straight line, this certain group of Americans that feel, I don't know what the word is, entitled to just get up in these public forums and scream about their oppression, their countries being taken from them. I don't know. What do you make? Do you agree with me that we're sort of seeing this constant stream of, I don't know what you call it, like public forum porn, where people are just getting up there and venting about nonsense?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it's going on here in Georgia with the critical race theory. And I don't want to make light of it, but sometimes you just got to sit back, shake your head, and just chuckle, because these people know absolutely nothing, like literally nothing, about the history of this country. You know, I hear some of the weirdest stuff, or like if I read something on the AJC Get School post on Facebook, and you just read some of the comments, and I don't want to sound elitist, because I'm not. I'm from a working class family, but my grandmother had a high school education, and she was one of the smartest people I know. My mother has a high school education. She's very smart. I read some of these comments, and I'm sitting there thinking to myself, what in the hell did they teach these people all these years they were in school? How do you not know that we are all living on land stolen from indigenous people through genocide? How dare you fix your face to tell somebody to go back to where they came from when you are squatting on their ancestral land, right? And then when they say that, go back to where you came from, to Black people, it's like, well, that would be great. However, the system of slavery was so intricately designed that they made sure they took people from different parts of the continent of Africa and they put them together so that they lost their language. They took our names. We don't know our last names. We were named after the people who owned our ancestors. We don't know what our last names were. And I think that when indigenous people, Black people, Hispanic people start to show pride in who they are, it makes some white people uncomfortable. And so even though they don't know the history or they choose to ignore it, they feel like they are being threatened or oppressed, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. A guy I had on the podcast last episode, he said that, I think he put it pretty well, that people largely grew up, they weren't learning history, they were learning heritage. And then when some history starts to come up in front of them, they reject it immediately, because that's not what they learned. That's not the propagandized version. And I think you say precisely right. Someone else's pride, they see it as zero sum. Someone else's gain, someone else's pride, someone else's heritage must be taking away from theirs. It can't just be adding to this country.
And I like that comment, because it's absolutely correct. And the thing that is kind of funny to me is I have an undergraduate degree in history and African American studies minor. Even with that, there is still so much I don't know. However, I still think that we need to re-examine what's taught in public schools with regard to history. And like you said, it's not really history, because we don't cover the difficult stuff. You know, if you opt to, as a state, if you opt to buy a textbook that calls enslaved Africans workers, we're not teaching history. We are pacifying those people, like you said, the ones who get up at these forums and are frothing at the mouth, we're pacifying them by not telling the truth. And I'm really worried about what this is going to look like when everybody really goes back to school, because you have parents. I wish I had this thing to send to you. I saw it a couple weeks, maybe 2 weeks ago on Twitter, where a parent put this note on Facebook telling other parents to request lesson plans.
I saw that.
Oh my.
Yeah. He basically, like, he has some problem with his school district, so he created this template. Like, basically, I want to scrutinize anything difficult you're going to talk about. Send it to me so I can help you, I think is how he phrased it.
And there was another parent who did a Freedom of Information Act request. It was 500 pages, Dan, I'm going to be doing math intervention. However, if I were to be teaching history and I got that request from a parent, I'm going to invite them to come into my classroom. I'm going to tell them, I don't work for you. I work for the students. I work for the district. Nowhere in my contract does it say I have to provide you with my lesson plans. I'll put my stuff up on my website and you can look at it, but my lesson plans, I'm not giving them to you. And any district that does not support their teachers in taking a similar stance, I can't say I expect a large exodus, because that's already happening with COVID. Teachers are leaving left and right. All districts have several hundred positions open. They don't even have any subs. So basically kids are going to be crammed into a room with nobody. But I do expect to see more teachers leaving, because what you're telling me with those actions is that you don't respect me. You don't trust that I'm competent in what I do. You feel that my profession is beneath you, but yet you won't go and get certified so you can go into a classroom and teach. So you're just doing something to be doing something. Like you said, they're frothing at the mouth because they feel like they're being threatened, because they don't want their kids to know the truth. And if you don't want your kids to know the true history of America, you are more than welcome to withdraw your kids and homeschool them.
Absolutely. Do you think schools will go through some of these threats? Legislatures are passing these, anti-CRT laws, but we've seen with COVID just recently, Florida, drawing these lines about masks and apparently seeming to back off a little bit, backing down in the face of districts that are standing up to them. Do you think a lot of these anti-CRT, anti-difficult conversation laws have any real teeth? Do you think schools will follow through against teachers, or is it more of a play to their base, the politicians' base?
I definitely think they're trying to appease the base. However, I do also think that this is going to die down because something else is going to come up. And those of us who teach know, you close your door and do what you got to do, right? Because if the standard is vague and it says, I can't even think of a history standard right now, but maybe if it says focus on World War II, there's so much stuff that happened at that time. Why couldn't I bring in anything about the Black soldiers who went over to the one of the concentration camps and rescued some of the Jewish people? Why can't I bring that in? Because it's World War II, right? Why can't I bring in the Tuskegee Airmen? That's part of World War II, right?
For sure. But have you ever noticed, Monise, how American schools love talking about the Holocaust? We love it. It's like schools will spend entire weeks, a unit on that. But then when it comes to something like slavery, suddenly it's what are you doing? Why would you subject my child to that? There's some kind of cover we get from talking about the Holocaust, I think, because the Europeans did it. So we can look at an example of racial inequality and genocide that was not perpetrated on American soil. I don't know if you agree with that.
I think it's because Americans, with regard to World War II, they see themselves as the heroes. But if you think about slavery or the genocide of indigenous people, or even when the Chinese came over, and you're in California, when the Chinese came over to build the railroad, I'm starting to get more information on some of the things that really went on. And I'm like, holy cow, how did I not know about this? So Americans were not quote unquote heroes in those stories. They were the villains. They were the ones who wreaked havoc on other people. So no, they don't want to tell those stories. They don't want to tell those stories. And what's really sad is because of the way that American history is taught, it's not only white kids who've been kept from a lot of stuff, but it's Black kids who've been kept from a lot of stuff, Asian kids who've been kept from a lot of stuff, Hispanic kids, it's not just white kids. It's not just affecting white kids. It's affecting all kids because we're lying to them. When you withhold the truth, you're lying when you withhold the truth. We're lying to these kids, but the good thing is some of these kids are going out there and finding the information on their own, and they're realizing that their parents have been a part of the perpetration of lies, and they're starting to question them. And I think that's the biggest fear with these parents is that they don't want their kids to know the truth because then they're going to have to reckon with having those conversations with their kids, and their kids are going to ask them, why did you lie to me? Or why didn't you push for this to be taught to me in school? Or why did you never have these conversations with me about the stuff that the school wasn't teaching me? And I think that losing that kind of, I hate to use the word control, but it is really control over people's kids has these people really afraid because they're not going to be able to indoctrinate these kids anymore because the information is out there. It's out there.
It is. I think of some of just the brilliant Instagram videos, TikToks that young people are making based on things they're learning on their own. And I always appreciate as a social studies teacher when a student comes in, like student last year, repeatedly asking me, like, how are we not talking about what's going on in Palestine? Why is that never talked about at this school? And getting to have that open conversation with students about, well, let's talk about who decides what you learn in school. Why do they get to decide? And I agree. And you brought up how this idea that anti-critical race theory is all the rage right now. Maybe it'll fade away because it'll be replaced by something else. Someone said to me recently, it's like the new war on Christmas, and it'll be something else. But a year ago when we spoke, you brought up the work that teachers were going to have to do, especially white teachers, in light of everything that was happening, specifically post George Floyd. White teachers needed to do some work. Do you think in the past year they have? Do you think that some of this legislation is being passed in these forums where people are going crazy is because they actually see teachers starting to push back a bit and make some progress and they don't like it? How would you rate how teachers have done since we last spoke?
You know what? I would say yes to that last question you said about why these forums are becoming so popular, but that's also in part due to the election. Those people are still mad, period. They're still mad because it's the same group of people rotating. It's the same group of people. But I do follow a number of white teachers on Twitter, and they are doing the work with regard to race and considering how racism, the system is built. Racism is built into the system, but more importantly, more people are listening to Black people, Indigenous people, Hispanic people. And they're understanding that there's value in listening. There's value in listening. Even if you have 1,001 questions, the value isn't just listening and asking, okay, what can I do? Yeah, the books are great, but we need some of y'all to be on the front lines because we got to rest. We're tired, right? We're tired. So I do think there are some people who are truly committed to doing the work, and they don't get offended when they're called out. Listen, I'm just going to be honest with you. Dan, we don't have time to hold people's hands, right? We don't have time to hold hands right now. It's too much going on. So if somebody calls you out, just know that it's an opportunity for you to think about something and to figure out what it is you need to learn, and then get back to where you were. Okay. So I think that's one of the best things is when you get called out, you say, you know what, I can't take this personally. If I tell these people that I'm committed to doing better, I have to be better at taking criticism too, right? Teachable moments, right? We do it with our students, right? So, what's good for our students is good for us. So we got to be able to take the criticism and keep it and use it as momentum to go forward and make some changes.
Yeah, that's probably one of the most disappointing things about the past year, starting with the election, is just the rush to victimhood that so many people, white people, take on out of the blue. Just suddenly they're a victim of everything. And to your point, exactly, like, we have to be willing to not get defensive, to listen. And also, a lot of us, a lot of white teachers work in environments where there may only be a few teachers or staff of color. And it's not their job to like educate us, to tell us what to do, and to sort of guide us along. It's our responsibility to educate ourselves, and as you said, like, get out on the front lines.
Absolutely. That brings up something else. We didn't have very many conversations about race in my school. Despite the fact that we were about 44% Hispanic. And then I want to say the next group was white students and Black students, but they were kind of like neck and neck almost. The only time we talked about race was when we were talking about test scores. Yeah. So it's weird. It's really weird to be in an environment where the elephant is there and it's literally sitting on top of us and we don't talk about it, because if you want to talk about test scores and performance and whatnot, you cannot divide race out of that equation, because 44% Hispanic, you got a lot of kids who were born here and their parents highly likely speak Spanish only, right? So how are we going to say we want to improve student performance if we're ignoring such a huge part of that student's identity, right? How can you say that you want to improve Hispanic students' performance on a test when y'all have to be reminded to send stuff home in Spanish? Those two things don't match up. They don't match up. So you can't take race out of the equation. And even if you decide not to talk about it, that's still not taking it out of the equation, because it's still there. And you're still going to be having the same conversations 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, 13 years from now, because you never addressed the problem.
I think you brought up the right word there, identity. If race is just going to be a bureaucratic term, just to be on that PDF that has the breakdown of test scores, then we're not actually trying to know our students, understand our students, and affirm our students for who they are. And for some of us, that means learning something, right? Like learning something about these families, about these students that are going to help us not just erase test scores, but see them as people. And a little humility is in order. But you are moving out of the Deep South. You are headed to Indiana. What are you looking forward to? What's on Monise Seward sort of on the horizon for you as you move to a new place, new school?
I'm looking forward to being closer to my family. I'm looking forward to working in a district with a teachers union. Not looking forward to the snow, but you know what? It's a trade-off. I get to work under a union. I'll deal with the snow. I have what do they call those things? I have a sun lamp. I'm just going to have to use that. I'm going to have to order myself a weighted blanket. I feel like, and I hope I'm right, I feel like I'm really going to be able to get in and do what I know will help some students. I don't think I'll be as bogged down by bureaucracy because there's a union. There's stuff that they deal with that I'm not going to have to deal with like I dealt with here.
Are you optimistic? Generally, do you find yourself being optimistic about your future, your family's future, the country's future?
You know what? I have days where I am, but then I have days where I'm like reading about all the COVID cases and these parents going to these school board meetings and shouting, not wearing masks. And I'm just like, ooh, I don't know. I say to myself, are we going to make it? Are we really going to make it? But I think a lot of my optimism does come from being in the classroom and working with the kids that other people say, oh, they'll never get that. And I work with them kids and I'm like, oh, they got that. That's where a lot of my optimism comes from. Another part of it comes from the fact that my 3 kids, are very aware of what's going on. The youngest is 17, so she's a high school senior. She's much more politically aware than I was at 17. But coming from that little small city in Indiana, South Bend, which has always been heavily Democratic, I knew the assignment. We vote Democrat every time. We vote Democrat every time. So my middle daughter, I had to go and get her did I get her in February or March it had to be March when her campus was getting ready to shut down. I went up to Ohio. She's at Kent State. I went up to Ohio to get her and bring her back so she wouldn't be stuck up there. And then we had the midterm and I said, okay, let's talk about what this is and what we got to do. So then we had to do the runoff. I said, okay, we're going now for the runoff. So this is what we got to do. And then for the big election, I said, okay, this is what we got to do. I said, it's important for you to be aware of who the candidates are and what's at stake. I said, but right now for this one, there's a whole lot at stake. And we got to make sure we do whatever we can to get the right people in office. So now she's more into it, and I hope, like you said, the kids on TikTok and Instagram, they give me some optimism too, because they are going out there and they're finding that information and they're sharing it with other people their age. And I think if they share it with people their age, those other people are going to be more inclined to listen to it, because the older people like us, they see us as part of the problem, even though we weren't directly involved with it, but they see us as their parents, and their parents are the ones who withheld the information. So I think if they're getting it from their peers, they're going to be more inclined to listen to it, number one, and number two, to go and do some more research, and 3, form their own opinions and kind of like interrogate what they've been told all their lives. So I'm optimistic about that too.
I love that. And I agree that the kids are so much more politically aware, socially aware than I was. They have access to so much more information, but it's not just the access to information. They're really thinking about it, and they're talking with their peers about it and collaborating. And it gives me hope as well. Monise, thanks so much for joining me. I really appreciate your genuine voice and your honesty, and you got a great perspective on teaching in this country.
Glad to be here. I could not believe that you said it's been a year. It's like, what is time?
Yeah.
What is time?
Well, that was my thought. I was thinking because I had so many people writing me and contacting me about last year's episode. That, oh my gosh, Monise, she was amazing. And August is coming up, and I was like, I should get her back on and do a little 1 year later.
You know what? I don't know. I am trying to remain optimistic about my move.
Yeah.
I'm just still a little disappointed that a lot of districts didn't handle it better.
Yeah.
Because there's so many expectations on teachers,
Yeah.
There's so many expectations on us, but then the people who make the decisions, it's like they were chilling all summer. While we spend our summers lesson planning, right, and getting our supplies and trying to figure out what new technology we're going to use and, asking people on Twitter, hey, do you have anything for this, this, and this? Because I know I do that, and I see people doing it all the time, and it's like, what were they doing?
Did you do state tests last year?
Yes, we did.
You
We
did.
did. Listen, we did MAP testing in end of September, October. We did it again in, hold on, January, February, and then we did it again in May, and we had state testing in April. Now, I was the squeaky wheel for the MAP testing because we did it virtually. The directions for the students to log in, Dan, was it 9 or 10 steps? Now keep in mind, my students weren't face-to-face with me, so I didn't get to walk them through how to use a computer. I sent the instructions to the parents. I posted the instructions on my teacher website. I posted the instructions on Google Classroom. I sent a video and I walked them through it. But you have to keep in mind, students who have processing challenges, you don't give them a list of anything with 9 or 10 steps in it. That's an absolute no-no. 2, 3 at the most, and then you have to repeat them. So every time we did MAP testing, there was a struggle with logging in. So I got to a point where I was like, you know what? If you can't log in, don't worry about it. Just go find something else to do. It's not even a big deal. We're not going to stress each other out trying to get you logged in for this test. Okay? So, because at that point, you know what? You wave the white flag of surrender. Like, what am I going to do when the people making this decision completely ignore what's the best practice when you're working with kids with a learning disability? Why would you give me 9 steps? Hell, I can't remember the 9 things when I go to the grocery store if I don't have them in my phone.
Yeah, 9 sounds horrible for anybody. So
it's terrible. And then I had to send it in Spanish too. So you got me trying to get these kids on, and some of the parents just they were not good with technology. So you got me trying to get the kids logged on, their parents trying to help them, and we're trying to get started with testing. And it took us like an hour to get everybody logged in. 1 whole hour that we wasted trying to get logged into a test. Dan. And you know how many times I joked to people and said, you know what? I'm really surprised that I'm not a drinker at this point. Because, listen, it would drive you to drink because you know in your heart of hearts and from your professional experience that setup was not good for your students. You know that.
Yeah. And the truly perverse part about it is now the testing companies are trying to leverage all of that into a year of, well, look how much they lost. So now what you need to do is add more assessments to find out what they lost, and then other assessments to help them catch up. It's sick.
Dan, we're going to keep talking because I want to say something about that. I'm going to tell you why I don't get into the learning loss conversation. Because it tells me that the people having this conversation know absolutely nothing about special education, because some of our students experience regression every single year. So we're not going to talk about learning loss, because if you bring it up to me, I'm going to call you out and tell you that you don't know anything about the students I teach, because they experience learning loss every single year, simply because of the nature of their disability, short-term memory. So, and like you said, it's the testing companies trying to make some more money. I don't want to hear learning loss, because you're not genuinely interested in what's best for these kids if you're going to continue to ignore the students with disabilities. And that's another issue, another conversation that we need to keep having, because there's still an issue with equity too. A lot of these conversations are essentially just like completely ignoring that group of students. You know, so when I hear learning loss, I'm just like, oh yeah, I'm going to pass by this one. I'm not even going to waste my time on this one, because you're blatantly telling me that you know nothing about students with disabilities. Zero.
But it's it's not. It has nothing to do with learning. Learning loss is just a ridiculous phrase because it's not about learning. It's about
they're trying to get some of those federal dollars by coming up with these new computer programs and these new testing. So they're trying to make sure they can get their money, because if that's the new buzzword, their program has to fit that buzzword so they can get that federal money, so they can stay in business.
Yeah, keep that adaptive software coming. Keep it coming. Oh my gosh. All right. Monise, thanks so much. Your voice is an important one, and I appreciate you taking the time to talk.
Glad to talk to you. I really was.
Thanks for checking out this interview with Monise Seward. I hope you found it insightful, but also just impactful, emotionally impactful, intellectually impactful. I think these kinds of honest discussions are so important for where we are right now as a country, as an education system. Monise is on Twitter at Monise L. Seward. If you don't follow her, I strongly recommend you do. Lots of the candid stuff you're hearing in that interview, you'll find on Twitter daily from Monise. I hope everyone's school year is off to a great start, and I hope this interview is a reminder that it's now as urgent a time as ever to be having open and honest dialogues with our students, with our colleagues, with our families about where education is, where this country is. And I wish you all the best of luck in these early weeks and months of the school year. As I said at the top of the show, check back in with us in the next couple of months for episodes on global education, on news literacy, and on developing readers, authentic readers in our classrooms. And as always, thanks for checking out What's the Big Idea? We're on Twitter at Big Idea Ed. Stay safe and take care, everyone.